This video is to show how I built a dynamic polyphonic synth in MetaSounds in Unreal only. I'm also doing some other things based off the MIDI input, but for now I am just going to be walking through the synthesizer setup and not really going into all the other triggering of Unreal. If you don't really know blueprints that well or how Unreal structures assets, this probably isn't the video for you. It's a little more advanced than that, but nonetheless, I'll give a quick demo and then I'll go into more in-depth parts of it. So right now, let me just play the demo. So I have this character, and you can see my MIDI keyboard over here. And as I play notes, you can hear the synth, and you can also see actors being spawned. I can also bring up a GUI and mess with some parameters on the synth itself. And then importantly, what you'll know, as you can see, I have a longer release time. If I, let's say, play a bunch of these, you can see on the left there's the red kill voice messages, and that's the polyphonic management killing notes to then start back other ones. So you don't actually have to manually add every key to the keyboard as a separate actor and manually set the notes. This is happening in real time as I play the notes. So I have 10 voices that are being triggered, and those voices, and actually I wanted to show one more quick thing. So I also have a timeline here, and this, I have some movement bound to this, and we can interact. And these platforms are also triggering notes. And you have a jump. And you can see the the notes that are generated, the objects that are spawned in the worlds are reacting to the position and orientation of the character, and height and in direction. So if I play that, see as I press the notes, it gives you the orientation. They are facing the same direction, including the Z value. So if I play it right, you can actually interact with the notes object that you play. So that's a quick demo of all the stuff that's built into it, but what I'm gonna go into is just show you kind of the synthesizer aspect of it and how I manage the blueprints and do the dynamic voice control management. So I'll explain what the MIDI is actually triggering first, and in this handy diagram I have over here, I provided a simplified block diagram of what's actually happening. because in reality, if we come to our list here, and let's go to our polyphonic synth. This little circle here is the actual synthesizer, and under the synth, you can see I have all these synth voices as child actors, and there's 10 of them. So we have a polyphony of 10, just because I created 10 of them, but you could create more or less. This lets you have a somewhat fixed number of voices playing from this one actor here. The other way to handle something like this is to make a separate actor with its own voice, essentially. So these platforms, for example, if you look at this voice, this plain note here, this plain note, all of these plain notes have a MetaSound synth here, synth note, and they also have a MIDI note association with them. So I can change the notes of each one of these, and they will, as they get triggered, they will play that note. So that's another way to kind of handle polyphony, is to have individual objects for everything. But what I wanted was just one object, and for it to act like a true synth instead of attaching each voice to a key. That way you can manage your resources more like a real synthesizer. So to hop back into the signal flow here, let's take a look. We first have our MIDI device, which is here. And that MIDI device sends messages. As you hit keys, it sends note on and note off and MIDI control. Note on would be when you put the key down. Note off is when you lift the key. MIDI control change is going to be like a slider or a knob that has a continuous value. So I'm making a MIDI device, and when you hit play here, you'll see this list of MIDI devices, and you'll see I also set a device to my controller. So this will be different for everybody. That's another video. In the blueprint, in the level blueprint, so this, when the level loads in, I'm starting by doing a sequence of things, but let's only focus on the MIDI. So I'm going to find and log the MIDI devices, and then I'm going to create my MIDI device. So that's what we're doing here, is we're creating this MIDI device. And then what I'm doing from that MIDI device is I'm binding functions to the events of that MIDI device. So these devices up here cast or call, trigger is a better word, these events with MIDI information, and those are going into the level blueprint. So that is what these arrows represent right here, is this section. So on each event, I have a control change event, MIDI note on event, MIDI note off event. And so the MIDI note on and off is where all the magic happens, and you can see that as these start, they bloom out and do a number of things. I'm not going to go over everything. I'm just going to kind of look into the synth binding, and because that's kind of where the magic is happening for the synthesis. But you can see here I'm spawning the note object, and then I'm binding character movement to the note values. So that's for another video. Let's just talk about the synth. So here we have the MIDI note on, and when the device triggers a note on event from a key press like that, it sends this MIDI information to this MIDI note, because I'm binding this event here to that MIDI note on event. And so now we have this event, which gives us the MIDI information. So this MIDI information here is right here. And from this MIDI information, I'm then triggering the synth and telling it to trigger a note on within the synth. So if we follow this blueprint, line here, we're now telling the synth to turn the node on. And then likewise, we, in the node off event, so when you lift the key up, we are also triggering the synth node off in the node off event. So that's how we're getting, we're basically just binding these node on and off events through the level blueprint to the MIDI device. So now our MIDI, in a certain way, you can kind of ignore this middle block here and just say these MIDI events are calling these trigger synth node on and off events. So what happens in the actual polysynth itself is the more magical thing, I guess you could say. So let's go and I'll show you kind of how it's set up. So we'll turn our attention kind of to this section here. As I showed you earlier in the viewport, our synth is just a little ball that lives in our world right here. And so in that ball, we have these child actors, which I have 10 of. And when we start, when this actor, which is our synth, gets loaded in, when we begin playing, I'm getting all of the actors of the synth voice, which would be all of these, and I'm putting them into an array, which I have down here saved as a variable, voices, and that's it. So I have this loop here, but I'm not doing anything. So I'm giving the synth access to an array of the actors it already has. So from there, the magic happens in the synth node on. So we're calling the synth in this node on event. We are calling the synthesizer function trigger synth node on. So our synthesizer, where we just were, we then are in these functions here. These are exposed. We are then saying trigger synth node on. So if I look at what that function does within the polyphonic synth, we essentially are finding a voice to use, and then we are starting it. So we're looping through all of the voices right here, and we're asking them, are you active? If it's not active, we then set the voice to a note and we start it. And this voice MIDI note comes from the note that was sent to trigger synth node on, which was sent from the level, which was sent from your device. So there's kind of this cascade effect of data that happens. And it's important to remember that this is happening basically on a real-time thread. So we're kind of just dropping data and letting it go because we don't want to do any heavy lifting in a thread like this. Once we set the MIDI note, so here you can see the polysynth sets the MIDI note, which is what this is, and then we start the voice here, which is what this is. So it's a little function, and this target is synth voice, which is one of the voices from the voices array. So that takes us to our voice. Our voice is what's responsible for basically being a wrapper around our DSP and what is doing the actual oscillating and synthesis. So this separates, having this kind of wrapper voice class separates the need for this polysynth to talk directly to here and lets us create functions for this DSP. Because this is a DSP metasound, the way you pass data in and out is slightly different. So what I'm doing is writing a wrapper function here, wrapper class called the synth voice, that then can interface with the polysynth much better and lets you ask data about this voice much easier than if you were to use purely audio parameters, which is what the DSP takes. So it is a little confusing, but essentially this wrapper class is just an interface with this in order for you to manage the data in real time without actually having to talk directly to the DSP. So once our MIDI node is on, once we trigger the voice, we are now in the synth voice, which is, remember, is just our wrapper class for this. So our synth voice here, which I have up here, is one instance. This is what's under the hood of all these instances. So inside this, in our event graph, you see nothing happens when we load in, but when we start voice, we have our functions here. When we see our start voice is called, from our note on, we're starting our voice and we're setting the voice MIDI note to the provided variable into our metasound, and then we are triggering our note on in the metasound. After that, we're setting it active, so that way the synth knows, the synth can check if this voice is active when another note comes in. The MetaSynth is the actual DSP. So this metasound up here is the actual DSP, and this is what that looks like. This is using some fairly basic synth techniques. I'm not going to go too in depth in this, but basically you have oscillators here that are generating sound, and we're using the MIDI note to set a frequency value in hertz of these oscillators, and then we're mixing those oscillators with an ADSR, which is controlled by these parameters, and outputs to a mono signal. So, and also goes through filter. So I'm not going to go into depth on that, but I'll show this here if you want to hit pause and look at them. So back to the business end. Once we are starting the voice, we are triggering these oscillators and outputting audio. When we lift the key up on our keyboard, when we go up, we are then triggering through the third-person MIDI device, third-person map level blueprint MIDI device. I say that again. When we lift up, we're going through the MIDI device, triggering this node off, and then triggering the level blueprint node off, which triggers the polysynth node off, which triggers the synth voice stop voice, which then triggers the DSP node off. And so this is here. This we're calling the synth trigger node off. If we go into that, we can see trigger synth node off. We are finding the voice that currently has this node on, and then if we find one that has it on, we are stopping the voice. So now we're going back into the synth right here on this and stop voice, and with now we are calling this trigger node off up here and printing the screen. We're also setting it to inactive to let the synth know that you can reuse this voice, and that additionally triggers node off here, which triggers our ADSR to go off. So that all happens in real time and is, I guess, somewhat dynamic, and just lets you not have to manually add things and manually add MIDI notes and manually parse every single note. You can kind of do this on the fly, and hopefully this was helpful to anyone trying to do something like this. There's a lot of cool things that I think you could do with this, and I have a lot of fun just kind of free roaming, seeing how I can interact with stuff like this and where it could go. Anyways, so a lot of fun things to do. Where's my mouse? I lost my mouse. Yes. Okay. So a lot of fun things to do. I also have my character movement tied to a BPM here. Seeing the walk speed is set from this slider. And that'll also change the vector of your direction. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you want to see more tutorials or show you the blueprints of how I'm triggering the movement and the spawning and setting all the locations for that and everything else.